I could tell he was struggling. I asked if he wanted a break, but he refused. He wanted to go on. I was 12 at this point, not a child, but not old enough to stand on my own either. I needed my father. He needed me. I had no idea where they were taking us. The truck was old and uncomfortable. Some of the men were sat on wooden slats at each side, but the rest of us just had to find room on the floor. We felt every pothole and bump in the road, and the drive seemed to take forever. Hardly anybody spoke. Everybody was tired and drained. Everybody was frightened. Everyone had their own story to tell, but kept it private. It was the only privacy they had left, their thoughts. When the truck finally came to a stop, we knew we were many miles from where our home was in Hanover. The back door creaked and swung open. I remember it being dark, but the sun was rising. Must have been around, 7 a.m. or so. We were told to line up against a fence and await further instructions. The truck pulled away and we were left facing half a dozen soldiers, all pointing their guns at us. Eventually another soldier arrived, and he wore a different uniform and was clearly the one in charge. I remember him smiling at us. Not a friendly smile. He simply said, "Welcome to Firstbuttel." Nobody in our party knew where Firstbuttel was or what it was. It wouldn't take us long to find out. My father had told me to be polite and respectful at all times, even more so here. He told me to follow instructions, do whatever they asked of me. I wanted my father to protect me, to keep me safe. But even then, standing alongside that fence, I knew he couldn't. He was vulnerable. We all were. The commandant of the camp was introduced to us. He told us to follow the guards into the compound. They would lead us to our accommodation, where we'd be given a uniform, work boots, and soup. I remember holding my father's hand incredibly tightly as he walked solemnly into the camp. The complex was walled and with lookout points every 100 meters or so. Each one was manned by an armed soldier. The place had been used as a prison before being transformed into a labour camp for the Nazis. We were told that this was mainly political prisoners or anti-government protesters that were held there, but the Jews, the queers and the Jippos had to go somewhere. So here we were. I was one of the youngest there, and I felt the threat of violence at every turn, not only from the guards. Even in the camp there was a hierarchy. Some of the men developed relationships with the guards. I did not know at the time, and thinking back I can only assume it was of a sexual nature, as nobody on the inside of the wall had anything else to give or for the Germans. I remember being beaten by fully grown men. My father was beaten too. I'm sure it was because he was trying to protect me. And the Germans never tried to stop a brawl. In fact, they enjoyed it. They enjoyed watching the enemy tear itself apart from within. No matter how ugly things seemed among the prisoners, this was nothing compared to the punishments our captors used against us. For the most part, in there, I escaped their violence, but I witnessed plenty. They would torture. He tailed off again, and I asked him if he wanted a break, but still he refused. The Germans, they would tear out fingernails and toenails. They would make naked men crawl over broken glass. For their entertainment, they would make people run the length of the camp wall while shooting at them for target practice. There was group beatings and hangings, whippings, anything they could think of to inflict pain. Half the time they would just do it to pass the time of day, to amuse themselves. We lived there for over 6 months, and my father deteriorated rapidly during this time. He couldn't cope with the workload. Hard labour in the forests and the quarry. His fingers were broken, his back was severely damaged, and his feet stripped of skin due to the state of the boots he was forced to wear. What little food we got was not enough to sustain him. I only found out much later that he'd given me some of his food to help me stay strong, and this was to his own detriment. The Germans had little sympathy. If he didn't do the work, some other Jew would. In early 1941, they decided to transfer some of us to another camp. It was explained to us that new armaments factories were being built in central Germany, and I was taken to Buchenwald with any other boys under the age of 18. The fittest and strongest were needed to help there for the cause. There were 8 of us from the group chosen to go, and my father was not one of them. He was in a bad way. I pleaded with them to let me stay to look after my father, but it was no use. As they pushed us onto the transportation, one guard approached me waving his pistol. "I'll look after your father," he said, grinning. I was old enough now to know exactly what he meant, and my legs seemed to collapse from under me. I think I fainted, but no one reached out to help me. The truck drove away. By the time I came to, we were miles away from Fuchsbüttel. I would never see or hear from my father again. I was alone. I had so many questions buzzing around in my head, but I stayed quiet. He hadn't finished. His timeline had moved on to 1941. For my own benefit, my mind was desperately trying to find links between Ernie and Daniel, but I couldn't. Ernie would only have been 12 at this point, living out his own wartime in the far north of England. Daniel asked for a glass of water and took a long drink before he continued. I was very much alone now, Paul. I had survived so much already, but far worse was still to come. I'd lost my family. I'd lost my life. I was petrified. I was hungry. I was exhausted. But the human spirit is remarkably strong. I must have had a will to live, even though I didn't feel like it at the time. Buchenwald was a camp on a much larger scale. I had witnessed brutal beatings, shootings, and even death so far, but Buchenwald was on a different level. When I arrived, it was quite clear that the camp had far more inmates than it was designed to take. We were allocated a specific hut and told to find a bunk and be ready for roll call. Lateness would not be tolerated. The huts were vile, stinking cesspits of urine, feces, vomit and blood. Each bunk was shared by 7 or 8 men. The stench stayed with me for years afterwards. This was another labour camp, they said. Labour designed to kill. The Germans invented new and toxic ways to kill, and the screams, wails and cries, all drowned out by music they played on the wireless through large speakers. I stayed in Buchenwald for 18 months. In this time, I worked in a nearby munitions factory polishing shells. Thankfully, for the most part, we were left alone in there. The dangers were far greater back at the camp. By the middle of 1943, I was a shadow of the boy I once was. My natural fitness had got me this far, but I was struggling to muster the energy to get up for work. I was approaching my 15th birthday, and I felt 50. Survival was my only goal. We heard rumours of the tide turning, of the Germans losing the war, but these were only rumours. The news, the real world, the wider world, it was as alien to us as anything else outside the camp. But rumours gave us hope, I suppose, a will to carry on. My final move, a welcome one at the time as I feared I would die in Buchenwald, was to Bergen-Belsen in North Germany, close to my family home actually in Hanover. I was moved this time with all the other German Jews in Buchenwald. There were a couple of hundred of us at least. I knew a few names and faces, but by now there was nobody I would call a friend. We didn't have time to develop friendships. Friendships could be broken, and the guards took great pleasure in breaking them, often pitting one friend against another for their own amusement. Nobody seemed to know anything about Belsen. other than that it was a newly built camp, another labour camp. Others told us it was a holding camp, just a place they could put us until they decided what to do with us, a last stop before Auschwitz and certain death. But we clung on to that hope. We were ushered into the Sturlager, or Star Camp for Jews. We were pleased that we were kept together at least. At first, life there was tolerable. The usual SS beatings were carried out and the regime was strict, but it was bearable. For the remainder of 1943, the conditions were as good as we could hope for, and certainly better than what I'd experienced before. However, we couldn't escape the idea that we were only in the waiting room, and soon the trucks would come to take us to Auschwitz. Things changed significantly throughout the harsh winter months. Prisoners seemed to be arriving by the 100 each day. Hungarians, Poles, Gypsies, Russians, Jews. Each day a new tranche of people herded through the gates. By the spring of 1944, the camp was dangerously overcrowded, and the violence against prisoners escalated again. The SS didn't want to be there. Their own workload had increased tenfold, and I think they were in fear of some kind of resistance movement. How? I do not know. We had the numbers, but not the energy or the wherewithal. In late 1944, I thought I was in hell. The decline over the summer months had been rapid. People were not being moved on, rather just left to die in that God-forsaken place. There was hardly any food, hardly any clean water, no medicines, no essentials, and people were dying everywhere. Bodies everywhere, left to rot. They were stripped of their clothes before they were cold. The old, the young, it didn't matter. If they were weak, they died. People didn't have time for sympathy. They had to worry about staying alive. Any food would do, cooked or uncooked. Rabbits, rats, birds, whichever poor creature that had the misfortune to step into the camp. Rainwater was collected and fought over. Thank God for the rain. The other water available would have killed us as clinically as any SS guard. By the end of the year, some of us still standing were shadows of who we used to be. We were surrounded by human remains, emaciated faces, skin and bone. There was no life in Bergen-Belsen anymore, even in us still living. How some of us made it into 1945 is a mystery. How we survived the winter even more so. But we did.